essentially people were chewing on candles, current day candles, and that was a form of commercially available gum. And what's even more interesting about this is that the way they would sweeten it as they eat it is they would take it out and dip it in powdered sugar and then eat it back.
Welcome to Behind the Shelf, a podcast about how everyday products are made. My name is Amar.
My name is Tarek, and we are your hosts.
Today's episode, we're going to talk about gum. You know, the everyday product you chew on. We're going to talk about some of that good stuff. Are you an avid chewer, Tarek?
Not as much as I would like. I've noticed that when I chew on gum for an extended period of time, first of all, my jaws hurt, but also sometimes my jaw locks for some reason. Maybe I have bad jaws. So I decided that I shouldn't do it. So I
So,
now,
no gum?
so right now I am pretty much not a gum person, unfortunately. I do enjoy it though, but I
I
can't do
have
it.
gum everywhere. I have gum on in my nightstand. I have gum in my work backpack. I have gum in like travel bags. I have gum in my kitchen. I have gum
Are you one of
everywhere.
those? Are you one of those people that are always chewing gum? Is that you?
No, no, not always
Confess.
chewing gum. I'm usually chewing gum like after a meal or something. Yeah, usually after a meal,
Just as a palate
like after I
cleanser,
had a snack.
essentially.
Yeah, mouth refreshener. Because you know the Indian diet has lots of garlic and onion and whatnot.
That's
And
fair. That's
then
a good
just as
point.
a palate cleanser.
Yeah, that's actually one of the main reasons why people in historic humans, essentially, and people back in the day and older civilizations used to do. They used to have gum or an older version of gum for that exact reason, as a palate cleanser, clean their teeth,
Oh,
and what have
oh
you.
yeah, that
So
makes sense.
you're sticking to your roots, buddy.
All right, that makes sense. And I'm glad you brought up like older civilizations. So similar to our pattern in all our episodes. Where did it start? Who invented gum, or where does it come from?
So if you look at the history of chewing gum, it actually started everywhere. You can find traces of it in every civilization that pretty much ever existed. You can look in the ancient Greeks, you can see evidence of gum use, similarly to what you just mentioned, for cleaning your teeth or palate cleanser, just to change the taste of your mouth. And then also you can see some other evidence in all the way across the world in the Mayan civilization and even in Native America. However, while the use is the same, obviously what is considered gum for them is different. So
So what are their ingredients? Like what are they chewing on?
the sap of the local trees that they had in that region. So, for example, it was
Okay.
mastic. It was a mastic plant, the sap of the mastic plant in ancient Greek. Native Americans has the spruce tree, and then the Mayans had the chicle tree, or the chicle sap is
Oh,
what they
okay.
call it. It's essentially it's this white. I'm familiar with chicle because there was a gum that I used to eat growing up. It's called chiclets, and
Yeah,
it
yeah,
has like
okay,
this
I know, I know.
beetroot.
They're single packed, right? And the little thingies. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, yeah, they're the small. They have this crunchy shell, and I used to eat a lot of those. And so chicle is essentially the base, or supposed to be the base. I'm sure the ones that I was
Oh.
eating were synthetic at that
They
point.
were called chiclets, right?
They're called chiclets. Yes.
Yeah, yeah, okay.
So actually, chicle is the sap of the trees that are native to the region where the Mayan civilization was, and it's if you look at it, it looks like this white sticky glue look, and they used to consume it. Just it became part of their culture, and even after the Mayans left, and in the modern history, like you talk about 1800s, 1900s, you would still people using chicle based gums in the region of Mexico, just
Hmm.
in that region.
Yeah, I'm
So
surprised
every
you didn't say Mesopotamia, man, or Egypt. I think this is the first episode we have not mentioned those two areas.
I'm sure they had variations of it. I'm sure they had like the pharaohs or the ancient Egypt, because at the end of the day, the purpose of you chewing on something is the same. Actually, in speaking of that region, not exactly Mesopotamia, but in that area, Yemen is one of those
Mm.
countries. Yemen and East Africa, like Kenya and Ethiopia,
Woot woot.
they would chew, to this day even it still exists, they would chew on a plant called khat, and that was at the time what quote unquote grew up with. They still use it to this day. They are known, especially Yemen, they are known for their consumption of that plant now. It's believed to have some sort of like a stimulating effect. It has a little bit of psychedelic effect, is what I hear. But even in that region, there was a variation of that. It's just whatever the local plant is.
Interesting. All right. So I guess where did we transition into the modern way of the gum, the pack self packs, or the the form we're used to? How did it get from sap to that?
Yeah, and actually, before we get to that, actually, even the early quote unquote modern visions or versions of gum were sap based also. It was just more commercially available, it was more industrialized a little bit. And you will notice with gum, just like everything else we've been covering so far, it existed in ancient civilizations, and then it saw an explosion in innovations around the Industrial Revolution. Exactly the same thing happens with gum. In 1848, John Curtis is the first person, he's an innovator and an industrialist, he was the first person to ever commercialize chewing gum. And he was using what the native, because he's American, he was using what was popular for Native Americans. So it was the spruce tree. And his first gum ever, and that's the first gum that's ever commercialized, it's called the State of Maine Pure Spruce Gum. And that was the first commercially available gum. And then you can, if you move slightly later in the timeline, a new variation of gum, which I thought was very strange, that came up in the 1850s. So just a couple of years after, there was paraffin wax. Are you familiar with paraffin wax? Would they use it in now?
Isn't it film and it's like film, right? Or like it's like
It's
sandwich wrap and
candles.
stuff.
Candles.
Oh, it's candles.
Candles are
Interesting.
made of paraffin wax. So essentially, people were chewing on candles, current day candles, and that was a form of commercially available gum. And what's even more interesting about this is that the way they would sweeten it as they eat it is they would take it out and dip it in powdered sugar and then eat it back. So
Uh,
talk about double dipping, sir.
Damn. Oh, before you move, I'm curious. Curtis, right, Mr. Curtis?
John
What
Curtis.
prompted? Yeah, what prompted him to like, hey, okay, I'm gonna commercialize gum.
Gum was already available in the region, and like I mentioned, it was already around, but there hasn't been anything that is widespread, cheaper, and something that is more portable that people can use. So just like other industrialists, today to me they remind me of any tech innovators, people in the tech industry who are constantly creating new technologies. That was the case around the Industrial Revolution, right? It was a specific revolution around making everything industrial, and he was the leader in that space. From a not a leader really, he was more the first person to have done it,
He saw
having
an
the background.
opportunity and he went for it.
Exactly, exactly. He
Okay.
saw an
You
opportunity
s-
where people are using it, and he commercialized it.
you said portability. I like that. But so then that prompts the question: before he did that, what format did people like consume gum in? Was it just like a packet of sap, or like how? Like what were they consuming? How was it consumed?
It was mainly just drops of sap of the plant that existed, and you would just sell it in the market in a very like non-branded way. And you can, even to this day, you can see types of those now exist in the market with very nice marketing and very nice packaging, especially with mastic gum. So you can actually buy the stuff where they try to preserve the shape of the resin or that sap and make it just small bites that you can just eat, and they pack it into a nice pack and you can sell it. So before that, it was kind of like that. Obviously, it wasn't branded and it wasn't as polished and clean. It didn't have the flavors. It didn't have any of that stuff. So he started that process of industrializing it, making the shape more consistent, and you have a packet and you can sell it and make money off of it, or more money off of it.
So that's 1850. What happened after 1850s?
So after the 1850, some of the names that actually are very known in that space is Thomas Adams. In the 1860, he was working at the time as a secretary for the Mexican president. And one of the projects that they were working on is to find a cheaper alternative for tires, for rubber tires, essentially. So he started experimenting with chicle-based rubber, essentially. So because chicle is native to that region, he started experimenting with that, and he tried for years and years without any meaningful success. After years of frustration and failure, he realized the opportunity. He created some of the most popular and more widespread brands. It's called Adams New York Number One gum. And that actually took over even in the US as well because it tasted better and it was better
Was it number
consistency.
one?
According to him, it was just like everything else, right? You believe them. He told you it's
All
number
right.
one, so it must be number one.
Fair enough.
So he played a major role in that he popularized chicle-based gum, just based on what he's seen in the region of Mexico. Obviously, it was popular in Mexico as well because of that, and became more popular than what John Curtis created, and even paraffin wax gum because it was just tasted better.
What did he do different besides just utilize his native plants?
The chicle based that he used is what made it taste better and have a better consistency than what was already available in at that time. Especially to me with paraffin wax, I'm not sure how chewy that would be and how bouncy. Because if you think about gum, it needs to bounce a little bit.
Okay, that makes sense. So after his thing, what happened next? Who came next?
So after that, you start to get into the brands and the types of gum that we are now familiar with. So in the 1880s, you get William Wrigley, who jumps into the chewing gum wagon and starts inventing in that space. And he creates the famous juicy fruit, and then he creates the spearmint. I think Wrigley also owns Extra right now. So between Mondelez and Wrigley, which is owned by Mars, if I recall, they essentially own the vast majority of gum, with the exception of Trident, I believe. I think it's owned by them.
Yeah,
So,
I can't remember off the top of my head who Trident's from, but yeah, and Mars acquired Wrigley, and it is the only factory I wasn't able to see, because when I joined Mars, they were shutting down. They shut down the Toronto factory. I wasn't able to go to it. Yeah, and I mean, I don't know. People still know Mars is still to this day a family-owned company, and they're family friends with Warren Buffett, who financed the whole deal. Just a side note for anyone who
really?
was curious. Yeah,
Finance the deal between.
he bankrolled the whole thing, the Wrigley acquisition, and then Wrigley, the whole gum became absorbed into the chocolate confectionery business.
Oh, interesting. I didn't know that. I know Mars is also based in Chicago now. So,
It is, yeah.
yes,
It's
indeed.
I didn't get to go, well, but it is what it is. But yeah, Wrigley's huge. I mean, well, now chocolate is huge. But yeah, the gums are iconic. I wish I got a chance to go see the factory. I heard it was really nice.
In 1929, another big invention by Walter Giemer, which is the invention of the bubble gum. And fun fact about that actually, the main reason why bubble gum is pink is because that was the only dye that was available when bubble gum was being invented.
What
So
a
talk
unique
about
fact. Huh.
very accidental, just like the invention of that chicle based gum that we talked about earlier. It's by accident. We talked about that in
Yeah.
cereal as well. It was an accident.
Interesting. Okay. What happened next?
The last innovation in that space, something that exists right now, it's a commonplace, is in the 1950 with sugar-free gum. It was actually invented by a dentist that was just looking for something to help his patients clean their teeth. And he used xylitol. And xylitol to this date is used along with sorbitol as sugar alcohols that are good for your teeth, actually. And they are very commonly used in gum.
So the dentist, he found an alternative with these sugar alcohols. What was so different about sugar alcohol versus standard sugar?
Well, as we all know, standard sugar is not good for your teeth because when you eat sugars, you eat any food and especially sugar, that is perfect food for the bacteria in your mouth. And when they eat that food, they will essentially pee off acid that will then erode into your enamels and your teeth. We covered that in our toothpaste episode. So this is the same. And if you remember from the toothpaste episode, we say how they intentionally make the toothpaste higher pH because higher pH mouth or higher pH saliva protects the teeth and it will negate the effect of acidity that the bacteria in your mouth has from food. And this is exactly what sugar alcohol does. Sugar alcohol will raise the pH in your mouth and it will help protect your teeth. That's why they use it in gum, and it's actually besides the calories, it's actually good for your teeth because of that.
Okay, so now that we've got to the stage where we can kind of picture what we have existing, how do they make it? Like what's the process? Walk us through like we normally do.
So, what a gum factory does is rather straightforward from a processing perspective. All they do is they get a gum base that is pre-made and it arrives to them as in like little pellets, maybe around half an inch, three quarters of an inch balls, if you will. And that gum base dictates everything you associate gum with. It's the chewiness, it's the texture, it's the bounciness. Uh, and they mix that, they heat it up and they mix it with sweeteners, they mix it with those sugar alcohols we talked about, and other flavoring, whatever that might be. And that's pretty much it. And then it goes into forming it and then packing it. But
So before we go into forming, just some clarification. Um, you mentioned gum base. What are they using? What are they using for gum base?
yeah, so the gum base formula, if you will vary depending on the brand. And that's what makes different brands more chewy, less chewy, more bouncy, less bouncy. In a nutshell, what the gum base has is, for the most part, everything is synthetic now. So they use a rubber that gives it that chewiness that you associated with, and they use, some of them might have even chicle based gum now. So they use that rubber. They use some sort of a resin that holds everything together. They have some of that paraffin wax we talked about. They have a little bit of that, along with other ingredients like antioxidants that help extend the shelf life of the gum, as well as fillers that help control the texture of that gum base. So the ratios at which these are mixed will dictate the experience that you have with gum.
You said rubber. So, um, can you describe what the difference is in this rubber being used versus the rubber we are all thinking of? You know, the rubber band, rubber tire. Can you explain that difference? Because I'm sure I'm not eating the same rubber that's in rubber tire. Am I?
You might be, actually. Sorry to
What?
tell you. So it's actually the similar. It's a very similar type of the rubber that you would see in rubber gloves on those latex surgical gloves. It's obviously not the same material where they would grind it and convert it, but it's the same molecular structure, and they would just use it in a different variety in gum, which is why there's I think this is what started the rumor that you're not supposed to eat gum, or if you eat gum it will stay in your belly forever. Honestly,
I've heard that.
it's not going to stay in your belly forever, but your body does not digest it, so it will just go through you without anything happening to it. So it's fine if you swallow gum, but obviously don't eat a lot of that, and don't swallow a lot of that because your body cannot break it down because it's literally just rubber. It might clog your intestines,
Huh.
which sounds bad.
Well, yeah. Cautionary note. But yeah, growing up, that was the thing, right? Don't chew gum. I mean, don't eat gum. It'll stay in your stomach, and you won't be able to digest it for 100 years. I forget what it was, but yeah, I like after hearing that, all of us kids would do our the best not to swallow gum.
I I I thought that a lot of the gums, when I learned about this, I thought a lot of the gums that I had swallowed, they're still in my belly, like just roaming around, floating. So you do an X-ray of me, you see little gums, but now I'm happy to
That's
know that
jokes.
it just goes through.
All right, so you have all these raw materials. What happens next? Do they all get put in a tank? What happens?
So the making of the gum is fairly straightforward. They add all those ingredients that I mentioned before, the gum-based flavors, the sweetener, the xylitol, sorbitol, whatever that might be. They add them all in a big tank that introduces heat to them and starts to knead them. And it mixes them for about 20 to 30 minutes to give them the consistency, and it gives them the essentially make sure the mixture is homogeneous. Outside of that, that's essentially your gum. Now, all you have to do is to just spread it and give it the shape that you're looking for, and then give it the coating. If you're talking about those extra ones, have this crunchy shell to them. So that's what they do that after. So after the mixture is done mixing and it has that consistency that your gum usually has, then it gets dumped onto this massive conveyor. It's essentially this big blob of gum that is just sitting on that conveyor that will then feed it into two big rollers that will spread it into a sheet. So if you're talking about those stripes of gum, whether that's Trident or Extra or those Spearmint, then those rollers will press the gum into that thickness that this has before it gets then cut and cooled down and shaped into what you're usually seeing. If it's going
Gotcha.
through something like a pellet or something like a little bit, we were talking about chiclets. If you're looking about something like that, that has a shell at the end, those will go also through rollers, but they are wavy in shape. And that waviness gives it that kind of fluffy look to it that when you cut it later in the process, it retains that shape, and then you can do further processing on it. So
Oh, okay.
after it gets pressed, it forms this massive sheet of gum. Then it goes through a stage where it gets cooled down before gets cut. And this is important because when you try to handle and cut that gum while it's warm, it will stick to the knife. And then when you pack it, it will also stick to the packaging. So they cool it down before they start to cut it and shape
So I
it.
have a question, Tarek. You said it's a thin sheet before it goes into cooling, right? Or whatever the sheet thickness is. Is the sheet, because it's on a continuous conveyor, is the whole thing going into the cooler, or are the sheets cut up into large sheets and that specific sheet goes into the cooler?
So that's very dependent on the factory and the company on how they do it. You have some that have the capability where it goes through this big, almost like a fridge, where that entire massive sheet will go through it. That will allow you to kind of bring it down to enough temperature so you can start to cut it and shape it. For the most part, that's usually what they do. And then they also, what you're looking for here is just to cool it down a little bit. So it's not really cold, but it's just ambient temperature so you can handle it.
Right.
So you're just blowing some
Oh,
cold air on it or warm, colder air on it.
gotcha. How long do you like? How long is that while it's in the cooling stage? How long does it need to be?
It can be up to 20 to 30 minutes where it's going through this. So they would slow down that conveyor, extend the size of that cooling station. Now, for things like bubble gum, where it's this big square, if you will, it doesn't go through this sheet making process. Instead, it goes through an extruder. That extruder, all it does, it forms that blob of gum into this never ending rope. That never ending rope of gum will then get fed into a cooling station. And because it's a rope, it is easier to handle, and that it takes it through a series of rollers that will allow you to cool it down in smaller space or smaller footprint. After it goes through that cooling station, similar to the other types of gum, the ones with that get the sheet done, then it goes through a shaping station. So the shaping station will then cut it and give it the dimensions that you see. So if it's a bubble gum, it'll do that. If it's a sheet like an extra or something like that, it will be done as the same.
Okay. Cool. So now we have our finished product. I like how, I mean, there's so many different forms of packaging. Um, I'm really curious how they get the little bow tie looking thing on the bubble gum.
So With bubblegum, what they do, this is a very specialized machine actually, that what it does, it's get fed two things. It gets fed the film, which is the wrap, as a continuous film, and then the gum into pieces. So as each individual gum piece comes in, the machine will cut that wrap into the specific size, and then it will hold it in the way of the conveyor that is transferring that gum piece. As the gum makes it to that wrap, an arm will push it from the back and it will fold the wrap around it. And then two arms from the side will hold the ends of that wrap and spin in opposite direction, giving it the twist that you see.
That's so, you know what? That's so cool because I've only seen it do for a little like bigger products, right? To know that they are able to guide arm a small little piece of gum, I think that's a feat of engineering.
It's actually very fascinating because those machines run at like five to six
Oh, they're
hundred pieces
fast.
of gum per minute.
Okay, so the bow tie thing, I that's pretty cool. But you know another one I want to ask you about. Hold up, this this guy.
Oh, the
How
Excel ones.
how do they? Whoops,
Oh, the
out of the
blister
way.
pack.
Yeah, how do they make this?
Yeah, so those are the ones that have this crunchy shell, I believe. And actually, these are my favorite because I just enjoy that crunch that they have. But before we get into the packaging of them, let's talk about how that crunchy
Yeah,
shell is made, and then we'll move into the packing. So,
sure.
similar to what we talked about it going through a roller that forms it into a sheet, the roller here has a wavy form that gives it that puffiness to it, so that when you cut it later in the process, you have every individual piece that has that puff in the middle. It looks a little beefy. So after it goes through the cooling and the cutting, it goes through a coating process. So this is similar to how frosting is done for cereal. It goes through what looks like a big barrel or a washing machine type machine that will take on all those pieces and it will spin them. As it's spinning them, there's a little bit of heat here to help cure the sugar, and there's sprayed liquid sugar on top. They do a couple of layers of that liquid sugar where they heat it and they spray it on and they mix it. The combination of the sugar and the heating will help cause that layer of shell. The output of that is essentially the final product that you see in terms of the gum.
That's cool. Okay, so they're
After,
almost doing a washing machine thing with the
yeah,
spray.
it's a very common way of coating things evenly in manufacturing because it allows you to move the product and also spray it, and then within 10-20 minutes it'll be evenly coated and it will be evenly cured to all look the same. So
Right.
after it goes through that process, it goes through another cooling stage to make sure that the product is perfectly safe for packaging and it doesn't stick to the pack. Then it gets fed into a hopper. So that hopper is essentially part of the filling machine. That machine is also fed a big roll of this transparent plastic cover that you have that you see. However, before it is processed, it is more flexible and it's not as rigid as you would see it here. So what they do, they take that roll and it goes through like a small molding station where it has heat to it. It heats up that transparent film and it will press those cavities in them. So it will prepare the tray for the gum later. The next step, it goes below that hopper we just talked about. And just because of the shape of the trays and the shape of the gum itself, they will fall in and they will fill up that all of those trays. Then it will go into a film application stage where it essentially has another roll of this foil that gets applied over this plastic tray, and with heat, it will cure it on top of it. Then they cut it into that shape that you see.
Right. And it gets pushed into the sleeve.
Exactly.
Okay. And then just for the folks that are not familiar with the word hopper, basically big stainless steel bowl.
It's essentially a big tank that you just dump things in it and then it feeds from the bottom of it into a filling machine or another, whatever the following process step.
Yeah. All right. Cool, man. That explains how this bad boy's made. Um, I guess similar to how we talk about a lot of different ones is what are the quality checks involved? Like, what's going on, and when does it happen?
So the more important quality checks are obviously at the finished goods product, right? When you have the product finished. Here they do samples, periodic samples where they collect just every 30 minutes or every 1 hour, depending on the site. They collect sample of the batch that is being made and they evaluate it for flavor, for texture, if it has that shell, for crunchiness. A lot of subjective tests, just like a lot of things with foods. It goes through that, and they look also. They evaluate the elasticity as well, and on off it goes, and that's it. And after it's packed into its tray, it gets put into a box. You have the slot code on it, and in the case of depending on the type of packaging, it would go through the X-ray that will make sure there are no foreign objects. It gets put in a box, and off it goes.
Um, are they doing any? I'm assuming they are, but just are they doing any micro tests?
Yes, absolutely. So the micro testing usually happens earlier before it gets into packaging. So in the processing, after that blob of gum is produced, a sample is collected to make sure there's no any microbial growth, to make sure there's no mold involved in the process that may be impacting that gum. So they check for that, and once that clears, then the batch is cleared for the next steps. That's the rolling and so on. Another Another quality check that is also common is especially with those ones with the shell that usually are white or have a certain color to them. They usually use some of the more advanced companies, they would use a vision system that will essentially inspect each of those trays and see if there's any of the gums that have cracked shell or the color of the shell is a little bit off, and it will reject that individual tray to the side, or gets inspected by a quality person and potentially disposed of.
Yeah, because a yellowy gum and you pull it out of packaging, as a consumer, you would think, hey, something's wrong with it, or it's past its best before date. So, I'm glad they have the ability to check that.
There's something off-putting about slightly yellow things. Like even with food and products that are yellow, they're usually brighter yellow, but something that is just slightly yellow seems sus.
Yeah. Are there any other tests, or that's it?
You've checked the quality of the product, you've checked the packaging, you've checked the end pack, essentially, you've gone through x-rays. After that, that's it. You're just packing into those trays, you're packing them into boxes, and it gets put on a pallet and onto the shelf.
Cool. All right. So, we covered a lot of stuff. How it started with, the ancient civilizations used the available sap from their native trees, and then we transitioned into the commercialization of it into more transportable, more pocketable formats, and we eventually got into Mr. Wrigley, who is the name we still hear about today. I like your bubblegum color thing where it just happened to be the dye available. I think that's very funny.
It's always
Um,
accidents that shape history, is what I'm learning.
yeah, I know. Okay, so then we learned about how double bubble and things like that have the little bow tie shape with the guide arms, and then it's rapid, but even at a rapid pace, the machine can form those, cool little, ending formats. And then we talked about the imprints of how Excel gum, like, or gums like Excel, have the blister packaging with a foil cover. That's pretty cool to learn about. I appreciate you walking us through all of that. I learned a lot about gum because it's one of the only factories I haven't visited. And yeah, you painted a nice picture for me. Now I can have a visual of how gum is manufactured. So I appreciate that, Tarek. So that brings us to the end of this episode. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Shelf. And we hope you like our episode. Leave us feedback, follow us on our socials. And given that, my name is Amar.
My name is Tarek, and always remember that research has shown that chewing gum actually helps you focus and reduces your stress. So, chew away, people. My name is Tarek, and have a wonderful day.
See ya.